Again, I want to welcome you all here. Thank you for joining for this webinar, Breaking Housing Barriers and Making Concord an Inclusive and Affordable Community, an info session on affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this webinar is sponsored by the Raise the Roof Coalition. And it's especially the members here presenting will be AFFH, eBase, and public advocates. But I want to thank you for taking time in this crazy, very tumultuous election season to take a moment out of your day to join us for this very important webinar, because we also see a lot of tumult also in what's evolving and unfolding in the city of Concord around plans for the future of housing in Concord. So thank you all very much. Just so you know, the Raise the Roof Coalition is a coalition of about 12 community groups that is very dedicated to creating an equitable and inclusive Concord and Contra Costa County. We seek to ensure that all residents have safe, affordable, and secure housing and a sense of belonging. We've been working on ending skyrocketing rents and the devastating displacement of immigrants, working class families, and people of color by trying to place political power in the hands of those who need change the most. And for the agenda today, our purpose really here is to ground us in what is happening to help make Concord a more equitable and inclusive city, particularly with a rezoning effort that is taking place in Concord. We will be presenting a little bit of background on this rezoning effort, explaining what is affirmatively furthering fair housing, and also talking about the need for affordable housing in this process, and also try to get up to speed on the rezoning. And we'll have some time for Q&A during this session, and we'll be sharing with you a call to action. But during this presentation, we want to move through all of our presenters. So we are asking that we save all comments and questions for the Q&A time. And really, this webinar today is both an information session and a call to action. So we're going to ground ourselves first with Reverend Millie Phillips, who is the interfaith organizer with the Faith Alliance for a Moral Economy. But let me just do a quick overview of who all our speakers will be. After Reverend Millie Phillips, we will hand it over to Latrell Powell, who's a law fellow at Public Advocates. And then Megan Nguyen and also Joey Flagel-Mishlove from East Bay Housing Organization will also be sharing with us, and also Alex Worth, who's the policy and research advisor at eBase. So let's begin with Reverend Millie.
Thank you so much, Christy. To begin our spiritual grounding today for this webinar, I'd like to begin by reading a short poem written during the pandemic by a mother facing housing insecurity and what that felt like in the moment for her. When my daughter writes the poem of this day by Jennifer Fitzgerald. I will be distant in black and mourning. I will be leaning into the open window as I drive us up and over, hauling only what we could carry through 3 boroughs. I tell myself she will remember nothing I want her to forget, as though I could shield her from failures I call attempts. These formative failures I swore to never. Forgive me, not all scenes can be painted in favorable light. She sees the view from the back seat, clenched jaw, my rising tide. Forgive me, for some of us, grief is unshakable anger. It takes up residence within us. For we well-practiced few, anger throws us into the dust of the new. Forgive me, I have dragged my child into my childhood, where I was more wildflower than girl, cast to soil by wind, rootless yet never free, incapable, me again, here now. Somehow not just me. Forgive me, I burned through all the saints and call on any deity that will have me. Let her painlessly unsee all but my hair catching wind as a bright but tenable flame. Let her remember me only as the woman who carried water up the hill for everyone to finally drink. Core to my beliefs is that we are all, at least metaphorically, created in the image of the divine. As such, we all deserve to have our survival needs met. In fact, everyone should receive the material and spiritual needs, not just to survive, but to live fulfilling lives and have the power to choose lives we love. Having an affordable, safe, and secure home is a foundational need. No one should have to feel like not having such as a personal failure. Rather, it is a deeply systemic injustice for which we should all be accountable to correct. What a gift it would be if everyone who does have a home they love would be paying it forward to demand that everyone receive the same practical and spiritual gift. Sadly, that is not the world we live in today, but it is the world we are called to build. Let us all show up on November 12th at Concord City Council and wherever else we are asked to be, to demand fair, affordable housing, unsegregated by race or income, for all of our neighbors. That is my prayer. Amen, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Phillips. Yeah, so as we go on to the next slide, we really wanted to contextualize like where the roots of this conversation and these efforts and this work really come from. And I think one of the kind of like flashpoints during the civil rights movement was actually the Chicago Freedom Movement. It was a 17-month campaign that incorporated Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King marching with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They actually relocated to Chicago because they identified Chicago as a city in the northern hemisphere of the country that was experiencing deeply institutionalized racism, separate and distinct from what was occurring in the South with very explicit exclusionary policies. Reverend King met with leaders in Chicago throughout this campaign as they're assessing, what are the various priorities that, they could contribute to amongst housing, education, employment. They identified that housing was actually one of the major areas of intervention where folks were suffering and feeling the most kind of exacerbated discrepancy in access to opportunity. Reverend Jesse Jackson was also there advocating on behalf of food and employment efforts as well. But the Chicago Freedom Housing Movement, as I mentioned, was a 17-month campaign where folks were protesting against what was called closed neighborhoods. And so that's where we saw, a lot of racial redlining and segregation, and mortgage agreements which had racially restrictive covenants. And so through a series of marches and protests, there was a lot of backlash from, white Chicagoans, white neighborhoods, white homeowners. They eventually were able to reach an agreement with the city of Chicago to open up public housing that was free from any racially restrictive covenants. And this was the site of when Dr. King had an infamous, 30,000 attendee speech at Chicago Soldier Field. And he, in proclaiming the victory that they'd won with the city, he said, this is a start. This is an important victory, but it's merely the start of a 1,000-mile long journey. And he was correct. So shortly after, in 1968, Dr. King was actually assassinated. And within a year, or within 1 week, excuse me, the Housing and Urban Development helped sign the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which is where we start to see the affirmatively furthering fair housing language become explicit. And so in 1968, in the Fair Housing Act, it states that HUD must administer housing programs in a manner to affirmatively further the goal to provide within constitutional limits for fair housing in the United States. And so on the next slide, we'll kind of see the more modern developments of AFFH. So in 2015, then HUD Secretary Julian Castro issues an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule after recognizing essentially that there isn't as much of a prevalence of racially restrictive covenants in housing as that had been made illegal several decades prior, but we're still seeing the kind of outlasting impacts of predominantly white affluent community members having access to housing and having access to the wealth to acquire more secure and stable and profitable housing. And so they issued a rule in 2015 to enable local agencies to better do an assessment that would connect the historical legacy of segregation to the housing access disparities and disparities of opportunity that we're seeing today. And then in the following year, under the Trump administration, then HUD Secretary Carson threatened to repeal the rule, roll back several progressive policies, and implement a housing funding criteria that would greatly disadvantage cities that were currently facing a housing crisis. So of course, state of California was really anxious about the potential consequences of this rule. And essentially the suspendment of the 2015 ruling. And the California State Legislature would then pass AB 686 in the year 2018, which would affirmatively further fair housing within the state of California, not just for local agencies that were receiving HUD funding, federal HUD funding, but it would extend the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule to all local agencies in all manners of housing and development. And so the obligation generally was that it would administer programs and activities related to housing and community development in a manner to affirmatively further fair housing and take no action that is materially inconsistent with that obligation. And that's when we see the update to the housing element requirements that we're familiar with now, which include the assessment of fair housing and contributing factors, the program of actions to affirmatively further fair housing, and include an inventory of sites that must also affirmatively further fair housing. And then now on the next slide, we'll see what this looks like in the context of Concord. So in Concord's sixth cycle housing element, this is a direct quote from the housing needs assessment, where they identified that people of color are more likely to be cost burdened and have a greater risk of housing insecurity as a result of federal and local housing policies that have historically excluded them from the same opportunities extended to white residents. And so some of the findings in Concord's assessment of fair housing found that there are patterns of segregation in high resource areas. There are disproportionately higher cost burdens for renters, especially Black residents, with 1/3 of them spending greater than 50% of their income on housing, higher rates of overcrowding in housing in non-white households, and that the inventory of sites identified that there were no sites located in what's called RCAAs that have again, predominantly more white neighborhoods, higher resource neighborhoods. There were no sites there that were zoned for dense or low income housing. And so the city of Concord committed itself to objective 8.6 in its housing element, which identifies the need to rezone sites to increase multifamily residential options in moderate and high resource areas with a majority white population. And so you see the criteria there. Again, you see like subsection D, which states that the city was going to accommodate at least 1,000 total dwelling units, the city is going to be committing to a combined area of at least 20 acres. And one of the things at the bottom and at subsection E is adequate access to infrastructure and strong development potential. And so the city has identified this need, and that's essentially what has kicked off this process, which Joey and Megan will better explain now, and just kind of setting the stage for why affordable housing is going to meet the current demands and needs for Concord residents, and how it could accomplish that.
Thanks so much, Latrell. So yeah, like Latrell said, I mean, what we're talking about now is Concord's goal of rezoning 20 acres in to date exclusionary neighborhoods to allow for denser multifamily housing. And Alex is going to talk a little bit about that call to action. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Sophia, do you mind? Thanks so much. So yeah, Alex is going to talk about the specifics of that process. What Megan and I want to do right now is ground that process of rezoning for denser housing in a framework of affordability. That is not something that the city has explicitly committed to yet. It has committed to rezoning for denser housing, but not for affordable housing necessarily. And we want to make sure that the city walks away from this process with a commitment to affordable housing in this area and in Concord generally. The reason affordability is so important in these rezoned sites there are several reasons. The first is that we're trying to disrupt patterns of segregation and concentrations of wealth. We can't do that by building more housing that is only accessible to people with higher incomes. We need to prioritize the inclusion of folks with lower incomes in these areas to actually disrupt those patterns. We also know that there are currently residents in these areas who are already facing pressures of high rents, inability to afford their housing. And so to prevent displacement when we do this rezoning, we need to make sure affordability is prioritized. We know that low-income folks, low-income renters, are facing the highest cost burdens associated with housing. We saw that Concord found that themselves in their housing element. And so to prioritize the most pressing need, we need to prioritize providing affordable housing. And as a final note on this, I'm going to add that the City Council in Concord has consistently attempted to reject proposals for affordable housing in other neighborhoods because they're saying, well, we want to affirmatively further fair housing. We want to prioritize affordable housing in wealthy neighborhoods. And we're not sure that they're making those claims in good faith. But in any event, they've been saying they want to build affordable housing in these neighborhoods and not in other ones. So we're going to hold them to that and say, when you rezone, you need to prioritize affordable housing. And we can talk more about that moving forward in the next couple slides. So when we talk about affordable housing in general and at the context of these city council meetings, we want to underscore the sentiment that everybody in our community has a right to a safe, stable, and secure home. And we'll talk a little bit more about the messaging as we go along, but we're going to lead with empathy, and we're going to lead with the ideas that affordable housing is really important to the people who can access it and live in it, and they have general benefits for our whole community in terms of improving health outcomes, academic outcomes, and economic outcomes for our whole neighborhood. And the next slide has some examples of that. The California Housing Partnership has a really interesting tool where they can go to the level of one city. So all of the data on this slide is specific to Concord, and they can actually calculate the benefits associated with existing affordable housing in that neighborhood. So all of this information is about affordable housing that already exists in Concord. It's not accounting for what we could build, what we could promote, but they're estimating that per household, folks are saving $550 a month in affordable housing, and that totals $12 million a year saved in Concord. There are also environmental impacts. We're reducing greenhouse gas emissions by having people living closer to jobs and closer to transit. There are medical cost savings where affordable housing is associated with reductions in childhood asthma and diabetes. So Megan just put the link in the chat to explore that tool a little further. But we can see already that there are some benefits of affordable housing in Concord, and we can increase that the more we build. So we can go to the next slide. We also need to change perceptions about who affordable housing is serving. So affordable housing is for anybody who is in the low income category. These categories, low income, high, moderate income, are determined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they're based on area median income. So they're specific to our area, specific to Concord. We were able to pull up some numbers for kind of average salaries in Concord associated with different situations, different family sizes, different professions, and look at all of these people that would be served by affordable housing. I think a lot of us consider folks working minimum wage jobs or folks on fixed incomes and disability benefits, and certainly those people qualify for affordable housing. They're categorized by HUD as either acutely low or very low income, but also folks that sometimes don't get considered. So teachers in our community would be considered low income, and depending on how many people they're supporting on that income, very low income. I also included the Trader Joe's employees. Some of the sites that we're including for, or that the city is looking at to rezone, are right next door to this Trader Joe's. And so I was thinking, would the people that work right next door qualify for that affordable housing? And certainly they would. So yeah, we just want to make sure everybody's thinking about who qualifies. And I'm sure we all know people that, would qualify for affordable housing. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Megan to talk a little bit more about affordable housing that exists in Concord right now. I'll just point out, again, in terms of who is served by affordable housing in Concord, this is a map that shows the different affordable housing developments that exist in Concord right now. About 4 of them are set aside for seniors, 2 of them are set aside for folks with disabilities, and then most of them are accessible to any type of community member or family member. And the only other thing I want to point out before we move on is that you can see they're pretty concentrated. And so again, that's the purpose of this AFFH process, is to rezone in certain areas to allow for more affordable housing and dense multifamily housing, where currently it's all really concentrated in one area. So we'll come back to that, but I just want folks to hold that map in their mind. Thanks.
Thanks, Joey. You can move to the next slide. Thanks for walking us through the many benefits of affordable housing and also providing the higher level look of the map of current affordable housing developments in Concord. I want to walk us through briefly the different colors and shades that affordable housing looks like in Concord, the beautiful developments that they are. All through, these are all the 3 that we are showing you today are all developed by various nonprofit affordable housing developers. So on this slide, we have Rick Judd Commons, which is nearing completion, likely in the coming months. It is 62 affordable apartments, very proximal to transit to Concord BART station, and with great access to local amenities in the downtown and Todos Santos Plaza. And we also have Robin Lane Apartments here, which you can see is a smaller development. It is 16 units, and that is because this project was a rehabilitation of an existing vacant apartment complex. So, both of these are affordable housing developments serving the lower income needs in Concord, but you can see kind of the diversity in the development size, and just it depends on many factors, as we all know, including the parcel size and what's feasible for the site. But this Robin Lane Apartments development is near the Monument Boulevard, and both of these are ranging from 30 to 60% AMI, and so focus on the lower income folks in our community. Next slide, please. And this is another example of a different affordable housing complex in Concord. This one is actually very close to the Robin Lane Apartments just showed you on the prior slide. I think it's about a 5-minute walk. but this one is 91 affordable homes. And again, in a great location near the Monument Boulevard, and also just shows you, I hope these visuals show you a bit of the diversity and also the beauty and what affordable housing looks like generally and also currently in Concord in the community today. Next slide, please. So now I want to cover how do we talk about affordable housing and walk through some examples of common themes. I think this group, folks in this room, we've all likely heard in opposition to affordable development more generally in our region. And these are also narratives that we have heard through this process in Concord as the city has been conducting its public engagement thus far for this AFFH rezoning process. Our hope is that you feel more equipped to respond to these statements with responses grounded in research and also at the same time acknowledging any legitimate feelings or concerns that folks in the community may be having around safety, perhaps in their homes. But all of that without accepting any racist narratives and coded or suggestive language about what affordable housing may or may not bring. So the first point here, building affordable housing increases crime. Crime is a very complicated and complex issue with many behavioral, social, and economic causes. And while the research is complex and findings have been mixed among many studies, there is no clear link at this time between affordable housing and rising crime in research. As I mentioned, the studies I mentioned before, while they are complex and of course, depending on geography and the scope of their research, findings are mixed, the overall takeaway is that there is no clear link between affordable housing and crime. And furthermore, properties that are developed in higher income areas using tax credits, which is the primary vehicle for affordable housing, are not associated with increased crime in the surrounding neighborhood. The same thing can also be said of higher rates of housing vouchers, also having no observed impact on crime. And again, I just think it's really important that we recognize the racial and class biases that contribute to common narratives around affordable housing, especially if crime is brought up in response to any new development or affordable housing. In many cities in our region and in the state, residents and owners often point to neighborhood character that they fear could be negatively affected by affordable housing. But this is often a more easier and kind of masked way for them to express their desire to keep certain communities and communities of color out of their neighborhood. Nextly, we also hear that previous slide really quickly, affordable housing increases property values. Again, there's a whole host and suite of research out there, but right now research shows that affordable housing has no impact on the price or frequency of sales of neighboring homes, and suggests that the research currently suggests that neighbors should have little to no fear from the type of attractive and developments that constitute a bulk of the produced affordable housing, the new affordable housing that is being produced in our communities. So again, when we look at the research, this is not a claim that can be supported through research. Next slide, please. We also hear that this process disrupts neighborhoods and diminishes the quality of life for existing and current residents. We want to acknowledge, of course, like many residents in the Bay Area, Concord residents do face many challenges to maintaining their quality of life with increased costs and displacement pressures. And a way to respond to that is to preserve affordability and support affordable housing, because that supports our neighbors and our families staying and being able to stay in our communities. Again, there are also harmful narratives here to suggest that neighborhoods will be disrupted and that they perhaps won't be thriving with the addition of affordable housing and new neighbors. And just want to turn back to what Joey was saying and what I've mentioned regarding affordable housing making communities wealthier in many senses of that word, in income, in health, and in community, right? A healthier population means a healthier economy, and affordable housing brings more jobs and more opportunities to invest in our future. And we'd be remiss, without saying that a stable, affordable home is the foundation for everything else, as was mentioned. It gives children and adults a chance to have healthier habits and focus on their goals and their education and their work. And there's generationally massive impacts on educational achievement, economic output, and opportunities for residents to be able to give back to their community. So we see this as the diversity and backgrounds in our communities and in Concord is a huge benefit. And lastly, on this slide, we also hear that through this process, local businesses will be shut down. And we want to be clear that rezoning in itself dictates what is allowed and changes, the existing use. So changes what is allowed on a property, but does not state and does not really dictate how properties are used. That is dependent on the existing property owner and whether they decide to pursue redevelopment after rezoning occurs. So just want to be really clear on that front about what this process is doing. Next slide, please. And lastly, so after responding to the common narratives or points of opposition that I walked us through, again, returning to being sure that we're leading with empathy. We know that all of us, I'm sure, and all folks want to feel safe and secure in their homes. And again, we can acknowledge feelings of fear or concerns, whether they're around traffic or, what maybe some potential, what current residents might see additional development bringing to their community. For all development, these feelings of fear shouldn't just exist for affordable housing development. But again, not to accept any statements of coded racism or anything that just is blanketly opposing affordable housing. So I hope those points of opposition, walk you through those points of opposition and how we ground ourselves in both our values and also research can ground us in the vision that we all on this call share today, which is to support a diverse and inclusive Concord so that everyone can thrive and live and safely enjoy their community. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you. So now that we're grounded in the history and the legal framework for affirmatively furthering fair housing and have a better sense of the importance of affordable housing in particular to the community in Concord, I want to talk about the actual nitty-gritty of the rezoning process that's happening right now. So Latrell mentioned earlier that the City of Concord committed in its housing element to rezone a number of sites in basically the most affluent and exclusionary neighborhoods of the city in order to proactively address the history and ongoing legacy of segregation. So the process started, I think about a year ago with the creation of a study area. And that's the thick blue line here. And basically the study area is to say, all right, we're just going to look for sites to rezone within this area. And because of the way the housing element was written, the study area has to be focused on areas that are disproportionately white and wealthy, and therefore also reflect the exclusion of more working class people and people of color. And so I just wanted to show you here that these blue shapes show basically the most segregated neighborhoods of Concord, that is the most white and wealthy neighborhoods of Concord. And you can see that the city did a pretty good job of focusing the rezoning study area on precisely those neighborhoods in southern and eastern Concord. Next slide, please. So this is this shows kind of what the overall arc of this multi-year process looks like. The very first phase involved gathering community feedback on specific sites within that study area that people thought would be ideal for rezoning, and just generally also asking people about, well, what criteria do you think that the city should emphasize or prioritize when it comes to the identification of sites for actual rezoning? So that process took place, and now we're in this sort of second column here where you see the star, where the city basically looked at the universe of all the properties in the study area, considered the criteria that they, had heard coming from the community and from the city council, and began to narrow that down to a list of specific sites. In order to move from the phase that we're in right now into the next phase, there is going to be a crucial vote at the city council on November 14th. And basically, the November 14th meeting is one in which the city staff is going to present to the city council a list of possible sites for rezoning, and they're going to hear public comment from members of the community, and ultimately it's up to the city council to say, yes, we want to pursue or explore the rezoning of these particular sites, which would mean basically making it so that more dense apartments or affordable housing complexes can be built on those sites. If and when that vote happens, we'll move to the third phase of this process, which is an environmental analysis, an environmental impact report. Once we move into that stage, it's very likely that no further changes to the actual sites will be made, which is why the upcoming meeting is really a pivotal, crucial moment to get the most and the best possible sites for affordable housing development baked into this process as it moves into the final stages. So this slide gives you a sense of how polarized feelings are about this issue around lines of class, in particular, whether people rent or own their homes. So the city recently conducted a survey, sort of asked a couple hundred people, what do you want us to prioritize in this process? And you can see how polarized the responses are between renters and homeowners. So for instance, the first category here, like, do you think that we should prioritize a smaller number of sites, basically minimize the footprint of this rezoning effort? Renters felt, no, you shouldn't, whereas homeowners were on the far opposite side. And so because of this really shows like the fact that, not all homeowners feel this way, but the homeowners who have participated in this process so far are really opposed to the goals of inclusion and affordability that are at the root of this process. Again, this is one of the reasons why it's important to bring pro-affordability, pro-equity homeowners into the process to give voice to those goals. Next slide, please. And to be frank, the mobilization among opponents is really having a detrimental impact on this process. So when we began this phase of the rezoning process and the city said, okay, here are the sites that we are now considering for rezoning, you can see the map on the left here. There were like 25 different sites. They were fairly well distributed throughout the study area. And it looked for a moment like, well, hey, maybe there's actually going to be a fair amount of rezoning that takes place. But the opposition and hostility have been so strong, and the sort of and there's been such a lack of a kind of counter narrative that as a result, the city recently released an updated list of sites, and you can see how radically truncated that list of sites is. They went from something like 25 to basically 4 sites and 3 possible alternatives. And I think the visual contrast here really shows that the opponents of affordability are winning right now. The ball is in their court. Next slide, please. So this table on the left here shows you the specific sites that are going to be coming up for discussion at the November 14th City Council meeting. You can see that there are 4 recommended sites, only 4 recommended sites, and 3 possible alternative sites. And so I just want to end by kind of, giving you our assessment in the Raise the Roof Coalition of like what we think are the really important strategic goals to try to accomplish at this upcoming meeting. One is we don't want the process to slow down any further. We don't want it to be derailed any further because it just seems as though the longer it drags out, the more opposition and hostility emerge. So we want to show that we support moving the process forward, but we also want it to move forward in a particular way. We want the city to move forward with the maximum number of sites, because in order to get really good affordable housing outcomes in the study area as a result of this project, we're going to need a number of different sites. Not all of these sites are going to make sense for affordable housing development. So the more sites that we get the city to approve, the more likely we will be to see really good projects that actually have an impact on low-income residents. To that end, we also want the process, in terms of future rounds of feedback, we want it to be anchored in the feedback that comes from the nonprofit affordable housing developers who really build this housing and the low-income renters who stand to benefit from it, not strictly NIMBY homeowners who are really opposed to the project, just in an absolute sense. And in general, we're playing a long game here. We really need to show that there are people, and particularly there are homeowners, there are people who live in these neighborhoods who believe in the benefits of affordable housing and inclusion. It would be a real travesty if at the end of this long process, the city council and city staff basically looked around and said, look, we did this whole thing and nobody said that they wanted it. So why would we do more, projects like this in the future? That's why we need all of you and really other allies who you might know to join with us to show that there is in fact community will for affordable housing in Concord.
Yes, and I see that we are coming close to running out of time for questions. I know there's one more remaining. I encourage you, Jabed, to maybe put it in the chat, and there's folks that could maybe address it. But I do feel the need, just given to respect everybody's time, to close at the hour, to actually just bring us home and what we can all do and why you were all called in to this critical moment in Concord's history. So we have an important call to action that involves coming out to the city council that you have heard referenced. And just a correction, it is the 12th of November. And we also have a survey. I'm going to let Joey do a quick description of the survey we need everyone to fill out.
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, so Alex showed us earlier those that breakdown of survey responses by renter, homeowner. Concord has been putting out these surveys periodically throughout the process, and this is the final survey they're putting out in the lead up to the November 12th meeting. It's clear they really relied on those surveys to make their decisions of narrowing down the sites from the 25 to the 4. And it's also clear that they had way more responses from homeowners in that area who all tended to feel similarly about the process than renters or other lower income community members, or even homeowners who maybe just weren't part of that group that all agreed about how this should go. So I say all that to say, please fill out the survey. It's really important. This version of the survey is very short. It's just 3 questions. And our hope is to use it to just demonstrate general support for the AFFH process moving forward. Like Alex said, we can't afford to let it slow down or get derailed at this time. So there's a guide that we've put in the chat of how you can fill it out to demonstrate your support for the process. It also asks you to rank the alternative sites that they've proposed, if they need to swap one in or add them to the existing primary sites that they're proposing. And we've done some analysis of which of those are most likely to be developed by affordable housing developers, and that's in the survey response guide as well. And just responding to one question in the chat, the survey is open to anybody who has a stake in the future of Concord. You do not have to live in Concord to fill out the survey. So I filled it out as somebody who works in Concord. We all have community in Concord. Ideally, we get a lot of Concord residents to fill it out, but please feel free to share this with anybody who might have a stake in how this process moves forward.
Yes, thank you. So please feel free to fill it out and share the guide and recruit others like folks who care about a more inclusive, diverse Concord and affordable Concord to also fill it out. And then the next slide, please. And then also, so just if you can't make it, Josh, for example, I know you said you can't make it. You already stated the example we want to set. Please send in your letters in advance. We need to also flood City Council with voices in support of affordable, inclusive housing in Concord, and they have been hearing hundreds of people. I think you've already that's already been shared. A few of us went to a community engagement session on Monday night, and there was almost 250 people there, almost ubiquitous in opposition. It's really demoralizing. But we know you exist, those who have an alternative vision, but we need you all to speak out. We'll be sending out, following up this webinar, we'll be sending out a guide also and a toolkit with talking points and some of the data we've shared. We also need you to weigh in with your neighbors on Facebook and Nextdoor. Nextdoor, of course, we all know has the capacity to stir up a lot of folks, but we need to insert an alternative narrative. There is a new Facebook group called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing in Concord, and we ask you to all join it. The chat, Joey put it in the chat, so please join and help offer your counter values and vision for the city, and bring a friend and activate another friend to get involved. We know that we all here on this call and in our coalition and all of our neighbors, I think we have seen the devastating impact of this housing crisis on low-income, working-class families, and especially folks of color. And we know that it's a hard task to weigh in on something that seems wonky, like zoning. It can seem complicated. Our tendency might be say like, oh, this is beyond me, but this is actually how we will shift the blueprint for and help start undoing segregation in Concord is through these nitty-gritty zoning processes. And I know it is, like Alex said, it's a long game, so this won't be the only moment if you can't make the 12th, but please join us to spread the word. And we hope that we can all build our voices and the neighbors who actually believe in providing housing for all people in Concord, and make sure it does not remain just a privilege for increasingly wealthy folks. So thank you all for joining in this critical time. I know some people had some questions. Feel free we can stay on for a few minutes for those who might want to ask some questions, but otherwise I want to respect everybody's time and say thank you to our presenters. Thank you, all of you, for showing up, and we'll be sending out more resources. So thank you very much.